Hi class, and welcome to this week's lecture. I hope you all are doing well. This week, this lecture is actually just going to basically cover gender identity and gender performance as it pertains to art. So we'll go over a few different artists, and we'll actually talk specifically about what I'm expecting you to do for this week's lecture, which will actually be to do what I'll call a selfie analysis. So it's kind of fun. And typically when I teach this in class, it's a lot of fun because we get our phones out and we look through Instagram or other social media platforms, and then we put stuff on the board and we analyze things together. But we'll try to kind of replicate that here through Blackboard in the discussion board. So I hope you have fun with that. But this lecture is actually going to be useful for you in terms of that discussion. So hopefully you're watching it. Well, obviously you are watching it, because I'm going to be talking about gender identity and gender performance as it pertains to your selfies, but also we're going to be looking at gender performance as it's theorized by Judith Butler in just a second. So, and this is just a part of your chapter, which is actually much more broadly on performance and the body and art in that context. But here we're just going to focus on gender identity. So basically I wanted to start by looking at the selfie itself. The selfie has become one of the most popular forms of photography ever. I don't think anybody has not taken a selfie every semester when I teach this lecture. It's interesting because it changes every semester because, over the years, selfies become different in some ways as our cameras become different, as our phones become different, as the apparatuses, or apparati, I guess I don't know how to pluralize that word, as these begin to shift over time as well. And so I always have students who tell me that they've never taken a selfie, which I don't know if I believe that necessarily, but it's interesting because I have to, I want you to look to your Instagram or wherever else, maybe Facebook or something, places where you post pictures of yourself. And oftentimes students have lots of selfies. And over the semesters I've seen more and more selfies. And I think because it's become much more common, and now we have the selfie stick, so it's easier to take a selfie. And selfies have actually become somewhat of a joke, right? So it used to be some kind of for a different reason, and now it seems like you kind of take it because it's funny to be narcissistic in some ways, or to take pictures of yourself constantly. But it's really doesn't seem as though a selfie is really about narcissism. Because narcissism is often something that takes place in private. It's something that you do by yourself. Oftentimes narcissists don't expose their narcissism to the world. So selfies are a little bit unique. They're a little bit different in that way. They express who we think we are, and the more of them that fill up our social media pages, the more people can actually see the range of us. So oftentimes selfies that we take will be different each time because we're trying to kind of expose different things about ourselves that we want the world to know. So I like always to show what Google Image brings up, and I think I've done this a few times in class already. So here I actually did this today because I wanted to keep it current. So this is the most recent, this is today what's up on Google when you type in selfie in the image search. So these are the most popular images that come up. You can see oftentimes you've got the duck lips with a kissy face or whatever it is, a couple of them here. Those are common in terms of selfies. You're always going to have, a couple of one of the hands is going to be extending outside of the picture frame. That's common of the selfie, obviously, because it's a selfie. But now we have the selfie stick, right? So there's a little bit of a shifting dynamic there. But you kind of basically see the same type of thing. But what I want us to talk about today is how people perform a sort of gender identity in their selfies. So let's take a look at what that means. And this is actually what you're basically being asked to do this week in your post. So I want you to look through Instagram will be what some of you look through. Facebook will be another platform, or any other platform you have where you actually end up posting pictures of yourself or others. So you can check out Instagram. I want you to perform an analysis of some of the selfies that are either of yourself or of someone else on your Instagram feed or Facebook or anything else that you have. So select a few of these images. If you're selecting more than one, try to at least have one be of yourself. I'm just interested in how you will analyze your own selfies. And then I want you to explain how you or others are performing gender identity. And this assignment and this discussion was actually inspired by an artist, Laura Knapp, who is a photographer who recently, 2014, has this this image photograph of herself, and she calls it Selfie, right? And that's exactly what it is. But it's become such a popularized means through which to kind of express yourself in social media. And so she's kind of playing with it as a professional photographer and thinking about the ways, not only thinking about the ways in which photography has become so popularized as a medium, right? It's something that we all can do very easily with our phones, and then we can apply these beautiful filters which make us look like artists, right? Make us look like fine art photographers, even though we're not. And so she's kind of playing with that notion, but also she's playing with gender identity here. So you might ask yourself, well, what do you mean by gender identity? Well, I actually wanted to show this video, which basically outlines gender identity as theorized by a prominent gender kind of theorist and feminist theorist, Judith Butler. So in the last half of the 20th century, the feminist movement has challenged gender stereotypes imposed specifically on women, but also on men. Both the feminist movement and the LGBTQ community have taught us that identity is actually something that is constructed. It's not something that we are given necessarily at birth. We are given a biological sex, right? So your biological sex would be male or female. But your gender is something different. It's constructed. It's performed. And that's something that is, or argued by Judith Butler. And here you have her pictured here. This is her very prominent book, Gender Trouble. And on just a little side note, you all know that I like to go out on tangents. And it's very easy to get me sidetracked. So here I'm sidetracking myself because you probably missed that because I haven't been in class the last few weeks. But as a side note, this book, I actually, during my wedding, my partner and I decided to throw this book out instead of throwing the bouquet. We threw what we called the bouquet because we wanted to kind of challenge the idea associated with throwing the bouquet at one's wedding. It's the very feminized thing where the bride throws her flowers over her shoulder, right? You all have seen it, and then whoever catches it will be the next to be married. Of course, this is very silly, right? And we wanted to kind of mess with that kind of gendered performance, right? It's kind of a performance that one might do at one's wedding. We wanted to kind of mess with that, so we instead threw this book, which is all about gender construction and how it's always performed. So it's called Gender Trouble, and it's written by Judith Butler. But that's just a side note, something that's kind of funny that I did at my wedding. But what I wanted to do now is actually show you this video by Judith that's about her theorization of gender as construction and as constructed and performed, and then we'll talk about it.
Welcome to the MCAT Multimedia Series, a MCAT analysis of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. Are we assigned our gender at birth, or do we simply perform one based on the values we have learned? Judith Butler is an American philosopher, feminist, and gender theorist whose book, Gender Trouble, published in 1990, explores this question. Butler thinks that gender is performative, that rather than it being part of our nature, we act it out. Butler believes our definitions of masculinity and femininity are constructed rather than inherent from within us. But more controversially, Butler adds that our understanding of biological differences between men and women is socially constructed too. This is an important point. Butler thought that the perceived obviousness of sex as a natural biological fact facilitated the assignment of values, judgments, and beliefs regarding how men and women ought to behave, and who they should desire. In effect, once the sexed body has been established as either male or female, it becomes an alibi of sorts. So, where might we see these social constructs being acted out? Let's imagine a couple that have just had twins, Hashem and Soraya. One boy, one girl. They bring the babies home, and over the next few weeks, friends and relatives come to visit the new arrivals. The responses to the two babies are telling. One visitor asked why they are both wearing pink, when surely the boy should be in blue. Another, seeing Hashem kicking his legs and scrunching his hands into fists, comments that he is going to be a fighter. Although Soraya is making the exact same movements, he doesn't say the same about her. The gifts the parents receive reflect broader cultural assumptions. Hashem receives clothes with spaceships and tractors on them. Soraya is given baby grows with butterflies and unicorns. Hashem gets a cuddly toy dinosaur. Soraya, a doll. Friends joke about them growing up and getting married, with the assumption that the babies will have heterosexual relationships. These babies are barely a week old, and yet they are already being categorized based on their biological sex, a classic example that shows Butler's theory in action. The supposed neutrality of biological difference actually serves to impose ideas about gender identity and sexuality. Although they often seem to be natural differences, Butler would argue that they are not. Judith Butler's book has influenced the course of queer theory, gender theory, and feminist criticism, and ignited intense criticism, particularly from the Catholic Church. A more detailed examination of her ideas can be found in the McCat analysis.
Alright, so what are the key things that we get out of this video? Well, basically she's saying, and it has been controversial, so I wish that we were in class so we could actually talk about it, but feel free to express yourself as well in your discussion post if you want to kind of talk with one another about, or if you want to talk to me or kind of write your message to me about kind of the things that come up for you in looking at this video. If you see this locally, if you see it particularly in children around here, but she's talking about how gender is a construct, right? It's something that is socially constructed, and even in terms of kind of our biological sex, that also is constructed socially, and she talks about certain examples, right? These are, for example, she talks about the two babies. This is something that I've seen very often. Some of you who might have, babies in your lives or kids or, younger sisters or brothers, perhaps you've seen this as well, but I noticed it a lot when I became a mother, is that, of course, everybody wants to know, as soon as you're pregnant, everybody wants to know, is it a boy or a girl? Because that's going to inform how they talk to you about it, right? And you might think, well, of course, everybody wants to know if it's a boy or girl, but really there's absolutely no reason that that's necessary knowledge. The only thing that people need to know that for is so they can make gender decisions about your baby before it's born, right? So what kind of clothes are they going to buy your baby if it's a boy? Blue clothes, green clothes, clothes with trucks and rocket ships and basketballs on them, right? And if it's a girl, you're gonna get pink clothes with flowers and butterflies, and all that kind of stuff. And I saw that obviously firsthand, but I'm sure that many of you have seen that firsthand as well in the babies that you see around here and everywhere, right? And I remember when my daughter Minnie was really little, she's She was born super bald, and she actually didn't really grow much hair until she was a year old. And so people would always ask me, and we didn't dress her in super girly things. Like, we didn't really dress her in that much pink, although my mother always bought me pink outfits for her because she wanted her to be very girly. But we'd always dress her in like blue and green and stuff like that. And people would always ask her assume she was a boy just because she had short hair. And a few people on a few occasions had said like, well, why is her hair so short if she's a girl? And I'm like, well, she was born with no hair. Like, this is, she's a baby, right? So it's kind of funny because there's this assumption that, boy babies have short hair and they wear blue, right? When it's actually, they're just babies. They're not actually, they shouldn't be sexed. They shouldn't be gendered yet. There's really no reason to start gendering them at such a young age, but it does inform how we grow up, right? If you are conditioned socially to be wearing certain girly things or liking certain girly things, you're probably going to like those things, right? That's just kind of how you'll be how your gender is socially constructed. Another thing I notice a lot down, at least in the valley, as I see more so in the valley than when I was living up north, is a lot of babies with pierced ears, and I've found that a lot of people do this because they want to make sure that people know that their little baby girl is a girl because she doesn't have long hair to show that. So we have big bows that people put on their babies and pierced ears. Like, my pediatrician offers ear piercings to infants, and I'm like, I don't need that. I don't need that, right? But many of you, if you're a woman, you probably had your ears pierced at a young age. I had mine pierced before I remember, like when I was 2 years old, right? And so this is very common. And all of this is just to say that our gender is constructed, right? So there are certain things that certain ways that people treat boys that are very different than certain ways that they treat girls. And this is really important. So not to get too much into that, and I'm sure that you've noticed that in your own life and in the people around you. So this is the question that we want to kind of get to today in that selfie analysis. But before I let you loose on that, I want to actually talk about how some artists, because of course this is an art class, right? But gender construction is all about visuality too, so it's how we present ourselves visually. So it's absolutely pertinent to our discussions here within art appreciation. So Sandy Sherman is one artist I like to bring up, and your book talks about her a little bit too, or Sayer talks about her. She was active in the 70s and 60s, but also is still around and is still active. I'm sorry, in the late 70s. She wasn't active in the 60s. So Cindy Sherman began to take these photographs of herself as if they were stills from Hollywood films. Um, and we can actually identify most of the stereotypes that she's actually addressing within these photographs. She did this huge series, and it actually demonstrates just how deep-seated our knowledge of female identity particularly is. So here you have this stereotype. So she dresses up to be kind of this sad woman who's waiting by the phone for a man to call. This is a stereotype that we've seen in film before. Here's two more photographs where she's really performing a certain gender identity that is very feminine in the image on the left. So here's this image, this kind of stereotype of the woman who just waits in her underwear all day, right, in bed, waiting for her man to come home, right? She's just a sexual object. And so this is one of the stereotypes that we see in film as well. And then here we have the careering woman, the image on the right. We have the careering woman who's out, she's wearing her nice kind of pantsuit, her hat. She's feminized in certain ways, where she's got this beautiful makeup on, but her hair is cut short. And so she's kind of this serious woman who we see, oftentimes we see this in film as well, who's out in the big city, careering, making her way to the top. So we see this one as well. Her work has been very influential and very important over the years for how it addresses gender identity and also how it addresses, I'm sorry, I don't know what I just said, how it addresses gender identity. I don't know what the last part of that sentence was supposed to be. I lost my train of thought. Must be Mother Brain or something like that, New Mother Brain. But it's been so influential over the years that contemporary artists have also kind of delved into the issues that she's dealing with here. So here we have, you guys all know James Franco, right? The prominent actor. Well, he also dabbles in art, and so he did his own show in 2014, looking to her works and then redoing them or appropriating them in certain ways, making them his own, and then exhibited his works in 2014. These works have been very criticized by the art community. Cindy Sherman has apparently likes his work and liked what he did with her series, but many have said that it kind of makes her work toothless, and so it really kind of diminishes the value of what she was trying to do at the time. But here you have a couple images that he's taken and appropriated and made his own to kind of comment on gender identity itself, right? So he's a man who's performing as a woman who is also performing in a certain feminized way, right? By looking at her photographs. So just to give you a broader, more contemporary context for these works and how this gender identity that she represents within these very feminizing, in certain ways, gender identities. Here we have the kind of domestic woman who's in the household, who's got the apron on, she's been cooking all day, right? This is another stereotype. So he's remaking that within his works. So that's just a little bit about female identity, but it's not only female identity that we see socially constructed as by artists here. So men are also being socially constructed, right? Masculinity itself is socially constructed. What are the types of things that baby boys get that baby girls don't get, and how do boys get socialized to be manly, right, as they grow up? It's interesting because you see this all the time, right? Boys aren't supposed to play with dolls. Boys are supposed to play with trucks and basketballs and all these things that are going to make them into strong men, right? So this is a problem. And Judith Butler would say, this is completely socially constructing our young men to be a certain way, and that way is to be masculine, right? So artists have also dealt with this. One of the first artists to address this was Richard Prince. And his mode through which he addressed this was by looking at the Marlboro Man, looking at the advertisements of cowboys used by Marlboro cigarette company. So Prince realized that they weren't just selling cigarettes, they were also selling an image. So here you have the image of the Marlboro Man. And so here's an image by Richard Prince of the Marlboro Man. And this image that he's referencing, right, the Marlboro Man was invented initially in 1954, but it was used all the way until the 1990s. I think it's not until 1999 that the Marlboro Man's advertisement is finally kind of diminished. But basically, he's the first kind of rugged cowboy that we have used in an advertising campaign like this. So of course we have rugged cowboys, we have John Wayne and all the other rugged cowboys that are around, coming to the forefront around this time and before, and of course after this time. But here we have the image of not only a rugged man but also a cowboy being popularized so that they could sell filtered cigarettes, because prior to this time, filtered cigarettes were basically considered feminine, right? It was a woman's thing, that a woman would have a filtered cigarette, and it was kind of like fancy women who could afford filtered cigarettes. But here, this campaign is like absolutely targeting men and saying, do you want to be masculine? Do you want to be independent and rough and tough? Well, here's a way to do so, is to identify with this kind of rough and tough cowboy who also happens to smoke cigarettes constantly. And there have been a number of different models who were used for the Marlboro Man, many of whom have died, right? So this is actually one of the underlying themes of Princess Image, is that the Marlboro cowboy here within the composition is riding over to kind of a space that we don't get to see outside of the frame. So he's symbolically galloping towards his death. Because of course it's known that many of these men actually end up dying because they were chain smokers, and we know now that it's quite dangerous. So especially this male identity was especially challenged in the late 60s. American attitudes about masculinity and male identity have been always in a state of transition since then. So sexual stereotypes have been challenged, particularly. The gay rights movement has played a dramatic role in challenging American attitudes about the nature of masculinity. This has much to do with kind of the protests and the kind of uprisings that that happened in the 60s and 70s, beginning with Stonewall. And you can see here um, uh, some protesters against gay oppression. And we talked. The book Sayer brings up some of Andy Warhol's work. So we've talked about him in the past, and of course he's a prominent screen printer in the 60s. But he was also someone who really experimented with gay identity and representations of gay identity, and he did a number of films and also photographs of the kind of gay underground at the time. So there's a variety of sources about that kind of thing in your book, so I'll let you kind of access that on your own. But I did want to talk about the fact that this didn't just start in the 60s and 70s. Gender identity has been something that has been challenged much earlier. So here we have an image by Man Ray, a surrealist photographer, of Marcel Duchamp. And if you recall, in the past, maybe we haven't talked about this yet, but if we haven't, we will talk about it soon. This is Marcel Duchamp's most famous work. It's called A Fountain. Of course, it's just a urinal that's been taken off the wall, placed on its side, and exhibited as art. And actually, I believe we will talk about this maybe in the next few weeks. So I look forward to telling you more about this. It's pretty fantastic. But this is what he's known for. But other than that, he also had this real interest in cross-dressing as a strategy for announcing that his biological sex was not necessarily one that coincided with his gender identity. So he really enjoyed cross-dressing, and he had, sorry, this is kind of covering the bottom. He had this pseudonym, this alter ego, that he called Rose C'est la vie. So you can see the name here. He was French. And so basically this sounds like Eros, yeah, in French. Eros meaning love, and then c'est la vie, which means like, this is life, or like enjoying life, right? And so this was his alter ego, and he would dress up as this beautiful woman. And then here you have his friend Man Ray, who was taking images of him at the time. So here again you have an image of his alter ego, Rosé C'est la vie, and then you have Marcel Duchamp as he looks as a man here on the other side. So thinking about gender identity here and how he performs femininity with the hat, the makeup, the pose itself. It's kind of soft on the eyes. He's got these kind of pursed lips, and the fingers, the very delicate fingers that kind of caress this fur lining around his coat, or her coat, I should say, versus this much more masculinized image of him playing chess at a table, a very kind of hard light as opposed to this kind of soft light. Here, in a suit, his hair slicked back. And so there's very different kind of gender dynamics happening here. I also wanted to draw attention to how women kind of perform a male identity. So in the early 1970s, Eleanor Anton began assuming a series of persona designed to allow her to explore the dimensions of herself. Here's just one of the personas that she began exploring, and this is that of a king. So you can see an image here of her performing her life as a king, right? So here she's got a beard, a hat that she's wearing. She walks around this way and ends up acting like a king. So she explores the possibility of being not only male, but also being a very powerful male. Here you see her heading to the bank. I think that this is at a bank. Another image of her performing this identity as a king, a powerful king. And she would talk about herself as being small in stature but grand in ambitions. He was exiled. He, the king, was exiled from his own country. He occasionally was accompanied by a small Pomeranian dog, and not pictured here. He spent time with his subjects, surveying land, and attempting to broker agreements and alliances. This was what basically the artist will go around and do as part of her performance as this king. It's a very interesting way to kind of explore one's identity, acting out her identity as a prominent king who'd been exiled from his country. And then the last thing that I wanted to look at here was another artist who I really love, Ana Mendieta. So she was working in the 70s. She's since passed. She died at a young age. But here we have one of her prominent early works while she was still in graduate school. So it's called Untitled Facial Hair Transplants. And as you can see here, she basically transplanted her friend, another grad student's beard, a fellow student, from his face onto her face. So you can see here the process, and basically the artwork exists as a series of photographs documenting the kind of this performance of her cutting off his beard and then reapplying it to her face, really manipulating her own gender identity. And of course, it seems really playful and kind of funny, right, in some ways, almost like a kid trying on mommy or daddy's clothing, right? But she's actually trying on someone else's beard, so it's actually real hair that she's transplanting from her face, his face onto hers. So very much dealing with gender identity here, rethinking her own gender identity and the associations we have with beards, right? And masculinity. So, and that's where I wanted to end today. Just looking at a few different artists who think about gender identity and how they might skew their own gender identity in their artworks. As you begin to think about how you're going to respond to your discussion prompt this week, which is to perform that gender a self-analysis and looking specifically at your gender identity. So hopefully now you kind of understand what gender identity means, how we perform it, and so forth. Just for fun, I wanted to show you. So I looked through my Instagram, and I only found one selfie, and I don't really take selfies. So it was kind of funny because in my mind, I thought, oh, I don't take selfies, and then I looked, and I actually really don't take selfies. Because I think we all think, oh, I don't take selfies. But look through your Instagram and see if you can find any. I only found one, and it's from actually a year ago, because it's from 2016, just around the election, because it's a voting selfie. And I remember that here's my baby. She was super young at the time. But here we went and we voted, and we both got stickers, and so we took this obligatory voting selfie because everyone else was doing it, right? Everyone was saying, I voted, you voted. So everybody was posting about voting, and so we did that. And I'm trying to think of how I would talk about gender identity here, and really all I can do, because it's really a selfie of my baby in some ways, so I'm thinking about how does this perhaps represent my gender identity as a woman, right? Is this feminizing in any way? Well, perhaps, right? So I'm showing my baby, right? So perhaps there's something that's motherly about that, so that's feminizing. But also my baby is dressed in a dress. I'm also wearing a dress in this piece, but you can't really see that. But perhaps I'm gendering my baby as female, right? She's wearing a dress. There's a little tiny pink bow on the front of it. It's not as feminized as some other baby outfits are, right? The bright pink with the bright pink bow and all that kind of stuff, with butterflies and flowers, right? Instead, it has cherries, which are gender neutral. But for sure, you could talk about gender identity here a bit. So that's where I'll end for today. Some things for you to think about as you prepare for the selfie analysis. I hope you enjoy doing it. Please also make sure, and I know I can't emphasize this enough, make sure that you're still responding, looking at other people on the class's posts, other students, and responding to at least one other person. And this should be kind of a fun one for you guys, so I hope you enjoy. Please do post your picture and then do a little analysis. I look forward to grading these, and I will talk to you next week.